I would like to welcome the first speaker of the Affirming team to begin their speech.
Implementing a land tax is going to bring a lot of benefits to society, especially in the long term. 3 things for you in my speech today. Firstly, on setup, my first point will be on government revenue. My second point will be on how our side increases land availability. First point here on setup. So how do we actually think that land is valued? So we think it's probably valued by demand, literally demand in a market, which we think is probably influenced by factors such as the geographical location of land. Like your blocks in your big cities are probably going to be valued a whole lot more by people than like ones in rural areas because they're just like near in locations where people have like access to everything that they need, things like that. Okay. Secondly, on setup, we think that this tax probably isn't going to be like a massive percentage of the land value. We think this would probably look like something like 1 or 2% when you're looking at like the value of a piece of land, like that much on like a piece of land that's worth like a few $100,000 is still like a massive proportion. So we think that having any great big percentage would be like completely unreasonable. So that's how we would view this tax as being implemented. First point here on government revenue, right? So the context here is a little bit intuitive, but the government spending is like hugely funded by taxes that people pay, right? So how does our side achieve like better government revenue? I mean, first point is like a bit obvious, but just it's more tax, right? It's more tax that's going to be going like directly to the government. It increases their revenue. This means that the government like now has more capacity to be able to like spend, like to be able to do like valuable spending in society, like things on your infrastructure, things like that. We think that this has like further impacts and it goes back into the economy to help people, which is really, really good. Second mech here that supports this is that this is probably going to be like a quite unavoidable tax, right? Because it's literally going to be on anybody who owns a property. Like if you want to own a property, you're going to have to then pay a tax. We don't think that there's much like way of potentially avoiding this because it's like people's personal like own land, right? It's just something that you're going to have to pay. And we think this leads onto this tax is probably going to be like a very steady stream of income for the government. And so we think this is probably going to be a good idea to implement this because firstly, you're always going to have the same amount of land in a country, right? You're always going to have the same amount of land. It's always going to be owned by somebody, which means you're always going to have the same land having like taxes paid on it, right? And even if there is a risk of like property values, dropping and like potentially the tax that isn't as much, well, firstly, we think this isn't going to be a massive risk because like multiple economies around the world are like still growing, right? And because of things like inflation and whatnot, which increases the value of assets, we don't think this is a huge risk. But even if it was the fact that like house prices dropped and like the value of taxes decreased, it would still be like a significant amount, right? Because you still have the same amount of property, and if property values are like even like $100,000 each, a couple percent tax on that is still going to be a massive amount of money coming from every single section of the country. So we think this means that this tax is going to be a very, very steady income stream for the government, which is actually going to be very, very good. Okay. What are the impacts of this? Well, firstly, it means that the governments just have more capacity to do good spending, right? They now have more money to be able to invest it in healthcare, to invest it in infrastructure, to invest it in education, which are things that benefit people, right? This is really, really good because it improves the quality of people's day-to-day lives when they're able to like go to work on a highway that's like put together and they don't have to sit in traffic for an hour because the road's like a meter wide and everyone's trying to move, and they can like go to the hospital and they don't have to wait for 5 hours in the ER to get scene when they're having an emergency, things like that, which really, really benefit people and benefit like their welfare in their country. Secondly, you've just got like more money to be able to stimulate the economy and then to like improve economic growth, right? And what are the impacts that come with this? Well, it means that people just have a better quality of life. Firstly, because they're able to earn higher incomes, they're able to get more jobs, they're able to get better jobs. People are more able to like afford the things that they want and afford the life that they would like to live. And overall, people are just like better off in their economy. And why is this like so important? It's just because we want people to be happy in the country that they're in, right? Like when the government is able to provide for them and have like a steady stream of income, that means they can provide for them. This is really, really good. I'll take a POI briefly.
How does taking money away from consumers via a tax stimulate the economy?
Because it gets reinvested. That is how government spending works. It is literally like a component of increasing like growth in an economy is government spending. Okay. Second point here on how we increase land availability. So what is the context here? We think that a lot of land right now is currently owned in most countries by a small proportion of the population, which is generally like your wealthy people, right? Who own like a disproportionate amount of land. We also think that these wealthy people have the tendency to just like buy land that is very, very high value and very, very high quality. So not only do they own a lot of land, they own a lot of the high value land. Okay, first mechanism here on how we increase land availability. First, we discourage like massive land buy-ups that wealthy people often do, right? Because when they now have to pay more tax, it sort of disincentivizes them to just go out and buy like as many properties as possible to like just have because they can afford it, right? Because they now have to like actually pay more money on that and pay money on it consistently, right? What this means is that they're probably going to reduce the amount of like these massive land buy-ups that they do. This means there's just going to be like more land available on the market, more high quality land available on the market. And so this means that like people just have more land available to them to purchase. Secondly, on overseas buyers, right? I think in a lot of countries you'll have a lot of like these big overseas buyers who will come in and buy like a massive proportion of the land and take up like a lot of land in a country. And those people like aren't really giving back much to their country, right? Because they're literally just taking money out of the economy by like using that land to produce things and then taking it back out of the country again. We think that by introducing this tax, it means either overseas buyers will firstly be discouraged to like buy a massive amount of land in these countries, or if that doesn't happen and they buy the same amount, at the very, very least, they will be giving back to the country which they are taking so much resources out of. We think this is really good because at least then people in the country are getting the benefits that I've just proven through higher tax revenue and things like that. Okay. Thirdly, we think that it prevents like maybe not your wealthy people, but your people who are like potentially trying to avoid like paying taxes and on their land and like taking up a lot of land doing so. Like you'll literally have people who will build like tiny homes which require like no costs of building anything like that, go buy a piece of land and like have a tiny home on there, pay nothing in rates, pay nothing in anything to the government because it's like a home that's like grey area, right? And it means that you effectively get a lot of people living on land and just taking it up from people who actually like might want it and need it more, right? And so we think that by implementing this, it means that people aren't unfairly paying like no taxes or avoiding this or paying nothing like back to the government on like the property they're living on. And we think this is really, really good because it makes things fair. Okay, impacts. Firstly, land becomes more accessible in the long term when you have like less wealthy people and less overseas buyers just buying an unreasonable amount of land off people. It just means there is going to be more land available on the market. This is beneficial in the long term because when you have more land available, by the nature of like the law of demand and scarcity, right, the prices are just going to decrease in the future. This will benefit like your first home buyers and your young people and just your average people who are wanting to purchase land because it's now going to be less expensive for them. Secondly is that like the owners of like tons of land actually have to give back more to countries now, right? Because if you are taking like a disproportionate amount of resources away from people, you should definitely be like giving back to the people who you're taking them away from. We think this is very, very important and we think this is why this stands.
Thank you, speaker, for your speech, and I'd like to welcome up the first speaker from the Negating team.
Oh wait, sorry, can we pause? My laptop's just decided to update OneNote so I can't write.
Yep,
Hopefully it
all
won't take too long. I'm really sorry.
What's the first?
It has been warning me all day, but I've been clicking postpone and then now it says no more postponing.
It's like that sucks for you.
Yeah, if it takes some time to update, you just want to like get some piece of paper and get.
Yeah, it shouldn't take too long usually, but if it does take a bit more than a couple of minutes, then yeah. Sweet, it's back. Sweet as, whenever you're ready.
Sweet. Our side of the house stands for proportion. The rich pay their share and the poor pay theirs. This is a disproportionate tax system and will take more from the poor than it does from the rich. So, to start with, a counter model. Instead of increasing the tax in a regressive tax system, we propose that we increase tax in progressive tax systems, such as income tax. It affects the rich and poor proportionally to the same effect in getting government revenue. Anyway, in this speech, I'll be talking about 2 points. The first being how this harms renters. The second being why low-income landowners are disproportionately affected. Firstly, some context on how this harms renters. Renters are poor. Those who can afford a property buy one. These renters may not be educated, they may not have a good job, they may have big families, high costs, or they may have structural barriers. This is all reasons as to why renters struggle to get onto the property ladder. They want to buy a property because paying off a mortgage is more stable than fluctuating rent that goes with the market. This is fact. Now, 4 reasons as to why this harms renters. The first, landlords control rent. They own the property, they get to decide when rent goes up and rent goes down, and this is decided by, well, secondly, how much landlords profit incentivized. They want to make as much profit as possible. They usually have a proportion that they set with their property manager if they can afford one, and then they will adjust the rent based on how much the market is dictating and how much profit they are making. Now, thirdly, this tax increases the cost of landlords owning and renting out their property. Like I just said, renters are poor, so landlords are giving property for those poor people to therefore rent, and now we're increasing the cost of it due to this tax. To maintain their profit, landlords need to increase their rent prices. Because they now have to pay this property tax, that means that because their cost of owning a home are higher, they have to pay more, and this is going to be deferred onto the renter to keep their profit margin steady. Fourthly, it is now a disincentive to buy a house. Property owners bear an additional cost. I mean, renters are just seeing this as going, this is unobtainable, I'm struggling to make ends meet as it is, why should I bother saving up for a house? The demand for rental properties are going to increase, and this leads to an increase in prices and an increase in demand. Fairly simple economics that the Affirmative team seems to understand. Now, on to the impacts of this. Firstly, renters have less money. They cannot opt out of living in a house. It is a necessity, everyone must live in one. They have to make sacrifices in other areas. This looks like skipping meals, this looks like not being able to afford to pay for things for their family. This looks like really dire financial times, and this is something that this tax will propel them into. And secondly, people are stuck in a rental cycle. They don't put any money towards owning the property because they know they just can't afford it. Now that you have to tax on top of them, not only for just getting onto the property ladder, now they have to pay a tax to the government. Whilst they also have to maintain it, they have to pay rates, they have to pay electricity. All of this adds up, and all of this affects poor people disproportionately more. I'll take a point.
Okay, so don't you agree that governments are aware of the fact that rent is a cycle and they therefore put caps on rent prices and on landlords to how much they are allowed to charge for rent?
Yeah, the government can, but this is a debate on the tax that you're willing to impose, and this is the effects that this tax will have. The government has every right to do that, but this is not a permanent solution. These prices are still going to be higher, and it is still going to impact poor people disproportionately higher. Now, on to my second point on why low-income landowners are disproportionately affected. Some context here. Poor people live on the land that they either inherited from their parents or that they bought it when the price was extremely low. This is the only way that they can afford to get onto the property ladder. They will now have to pay a tax. Rich people have more income than poor people, therefore that's why they're rich. Just have to make that statement. On to the reasons why this is true. 4 of them. The first, the value of rich and poor people's land will be similar. For example, factors that affect this, like as stated, are the location and the size of the land. We agree with this is fairly symmetrical. However, these factors are not directly linked to a person's income. Now, different incomes, same neighbourhood, the tax will be the same. This is why it affects poor people higher, because you can be in the same place. You can be making like 30 grand here, 100 grand here. Same plot of land, not excluding the quality of the house. They're going to be paying the exact same tax, which is why this is disproportionate. Although these people are in the same areas, what differs is the quality of the house. And rich people may have the disposable income to improve it, renovate it, like expand it, do anything they could possibly want to it. But poor people are stuck. And this person who can afford to do all these renovations has more income. They will still pay the same tax. This is not a fair system. This is in no way fair to these poor people who already have it tough. Therefore, they are poor. They now have another tax imposed upon them that is disproportionate to their income. The affirmative team cannot claim that this system's fair and that they are not redistributing income. Now, thirdly, rich people have the more power to evade tax. So they are better educated, they know their way around the system, they have access to lawyers, they have access to consultants, and these people can advise them on where to go and how to get the least out of this tax. Now, these tools are not available to low-income people because they simply can't afford them. High-income people can, and they probably will, because they are not particularly keen on giving up their hard-earned money onto tax like anyone is. Fourthly, rich people have more freedom. They have the means to relocate or switch to renting whenever they choose. If they see that the market, property prices are going up, but rental prices are fairly stable, they'll just switch. Poor people don't. They are stuck. When the prices go up, their prices go up. They have no flexibility in how much they pay, and these costs to them are unescapable. Poor people may not be able to afford, say they want to sell their property, right? Because I feel like this hypothetical is going to come eventually. Say they want to sell their property and go back to renting, which should somehow be cheaper. They may not even be able to afford to sell their property because of this tax cost. Now, the impacts of this are significant. This increases wealth inequality. This is a massive one. Rich people are less likely to pay it because of the reasons I just gave you. It is a regressive tax system because it treats everyone equally, even if they aren't. And it is not proportional to income. Whereas our counter model of increasing income tax, as it is a progressive system, is proportional. And it will deliver the same outcomes in that AF claim they get with increased government revenue. Now, no matter how high or how low this property tax system is, it'll still affect low-income people the most. And this is a harm that we do not stand for on this side. Now, affirmative claim that they want the people to be happy. Now, something my second speaker will touch on mainly, but people are not going to be happy when their hard-earned money is being taken away in the name of some property tax that doesn't even benefit those poorest people. This tax is not fair, and there's something our side of the house does not stand for.
Speak for a speech, and I would like to welcome up the speaker to the affirmative team.
Neg seems to live in a world where they believe that the wealthy and the poor are going to live completely equal lives. They're going to live in the same neighbourhoods. They are going to be able to afford the same properties, and therefore this tax system is not going to be fair. That is not true, and I do think they need to have another look at Ella's setup that she gave you at first, because it does prove to you that all of their material is not true. A few things I'll be doing for my speech today. Some rebuttal to the first point by first negating, rebuttal to their second point, and then a little bit of extension for my substantive contribution, but also some re-impacting of Ella's point. Okay, so firstly, it is proportional, because I do not think that someone like living in a tiny little house in the south of Auckland is going to have a property that is worth the same as, like, I don't know, a landowner in the middle of the central city of Auckland, right? Obviously this is going to be disproportionate based on all the reasons we gave you in setup. This is not going to have an equal value and like price, therefore taxing is going to look different for these individuals, and again, it is more progressive than they're trying to say. Okay, now onto their first point. They say that renters are going to struggle to get properties. So they said that renters are going to struggle to purchase properties. Ella gave you a lot of reasons, like economic sort of reasons, around the fact that we are going to start increasing the availability of land, which does inherently decrease costs. We didn't really get any engagement as to why this isn't going to be true, so I think it still stands, and therefore that entire point, or that entire mechanism, is actually completely false. But let's say, like, these prices aren't going to be reduced. I think governments are still aware of the fact that poverty and renting is cyclical. As I flagged in my POI, there are caps that landowners can put on, governments can put on landowners like rent that they're charging. But then there's also the fact that there's only like such a high price that they can charge for rent till it gets to a point where people literally will refuse to rent their house, right? Like people are just not going to go live in a house if they literally cannot afford it. We also heard that because landlords are profit incentivized, they're going to like do all these really horrible things to their renters. Obviously this is true to an extent. However, again, there's only so many things that these people can actually literally get away with until it gets to a point where people choose to just not engage. We also heard that this disincentivizes purchasing of houses because these people are struggling more. I don't think that this impact works at all because of all the reasons I gave you just before. And then we also heard that renters again are going to start sacrificing things like food because like rent is cyclical, right? I think people who are in that cycle is probably going to be, let's say, like take them at their best, it's going to be symmetrical on our side, right? People do need to make sacrifices if they need to pay for things. Unfortunately, that is the case. I don't think either side can claim that they are just going to stop poverty and just prevent it entirely, right? What we get on our side is improved things like social benefits because our governments are literally earning more money, right? Like they have more of a capacity to help these people than relying on a wealthy person who they have literally characterized as more capable of evading tax. We have given you a lot of material as to why this tax is so difficult to evade. Like, what are you going to do? Put a false name under the fact that you own this property? Like, that literally will not happen, right? So we get more income from governments. They obviously do have more of a capacity to then take care of people, right? Okay, now on to their second point. They said that, again, same characterization, rich people have more of a capacity to evade this tax. I think where they were trying to go, like, is maybe they're going to buy a property that isn't worth as much and then like build something on it that is worth like a bit more. I think that's where they were trying to go. However, I don't think that this is going to have the large scale impact that they think for a few reasons. Firstly, if you do buy, I don't know, like a property in the middle of like Mangawhai, or no, that's a bad example, Mangaramia, and you build like a hotel or something, that's probably not going to get any sort of financial benefits to this person because it's in the middle of nowhere. I don't think anyone's going to have any incentive to engage with this property in the first place. But then secondly, like I don't think landowners are this, like these wealthy individuals care that much, right? It's not it's not a tax that's to an extent that's going to genuinely harm their income or their revenue, but it is tax that is to the extent that can benefit a government. So I think we've been really fair on that. We also heard a lot of the material, like I'm going to have a neighbour who earns $30,000 a year, I earn $100,000. I don't think these people literally live in the same places, and therefore this just doesn't stand, because if you are earning such a small income, the odds that you're renting are probably quite high. But even if you do own a property, it's probably not going to be to the same value, because I don't think that people are willingly going to live in that situation. I'll take a quick POI.
If you have a neighbourhood with two houses, one of them is nicer than the other, but they're on land of the same value, do you assume that the people in those houses have exactly the same income?
No, I don't. Okay, I'm not really sure where that POI was supposed to go. But if people live in the same neighbourhood, properties are vaguely going to have a very similar price regardless, right? Because this is about things like Ella was saying, if a property is a certain distance from like a CBD, it's probably going to have either an increase or decrease in value, right? So I am probably going to make an assumption that these people are in vaguely similar financial positions. And if they aren't, there's probably going to be a symmetrical harm, right? If this person has just lost their job and have been like a year with no income, they're probably going to be forced to sell their house, which is like going to be similar, so I don't think like this individual is going to be harmed more under our side anyway. Okay, so why is it actually so important that we are going to help people more in their day-to-day lives through the more like greater investment from governments? Like Alice said, we're going to be more capable of stimulating the economy. A major harm under their side is the fact that we have people who can mass buy properties, like for example in New Zealand, and then build houses and rent these. What's harmful about it is there's no money coming back into New Zealand. The dollar value literally loses, like, I don't know, its global exchange rate value because there's just less of it in the world, right? Which I think inherently does harm a country's economy from my like knowledge of economics. And this is obviously going to be harmful to people on the ground, right? Like people do suffer when their money is literally worth less. They do struggle more in their day-to-day lives. They do have to sacrifice things like meals. I'll take a POI real quick.
What happens when home ownership falls due to people not being able to pay the tax? Yes, you'll receive your government income, but now landlords own all the property.
Well, no, that's not going to happen because again, we're basing this on the fact like how in demand is this property like in terms of the market, right? So I think the tax is going to decrease, or the like revenue that they're going to be generating is going to decrease if less properties are being bought and sold. Therefore, I don't think that really stands because there's like. Yeah, it doesn't really matter. Okay, what else do we actually get under our side? We get more accessibility to resources for regular people. The government now has the capacity to go put a hospital in a rural area where there has been no access to medical care whatsoever. What they are relying on is wealthy people being honest, which I don't think we can really assume is going to happen because it literally doesn't right now. You see people hiring like really good accountants who are super good at evading the law. You see things like offshore accounts that aren't going to receive the same taxes or like anything like that, right? And this again harms your government because money is leaving the country and not coming back. For all of these reasons, I think their side is much more harmful for this group that they are trying to claim they are going to benefit.
Speaker for a speech, and I'd like to welcome up the second speaker closing the meeting.
A couple of things to do in the speech. Firstly, a bit of characterisation on how land is valued. Secondly, on government revenue. Next, on rent caps and availability. And finally, a split on public backlash. Okay, firstly then on land valuation. What determines the value of land? We tell you it is things like location, right? But what we also tell you is that you can have varying income households in similar locations. right? The reason for this is like the fact of what determines where people live. This is things like proximity to work or to other family members and things like that. What this means then is that you have like rich and poor people may be wanting to live in like a rural area, for example, or like on a lifestyle block in a rural area because of the fact that it's like out of the way of traffic and congestion. Both of these groups may want to have this thing that is something down to your lifestyle preferences, not just down to your income. I think what's important to know is that most societies are not just this like stratified and unequal in their distribution, right? You don't have rich people all being friends and living next to each other. You don't have poor people all being friends and living next to each other. People care about things more than that. I think what this means then for the debate is that you can have poor and rich people with fairly similar valued land because they're living in similar locations and therefore paying the same tax. What then differs between these rich and poor people, right? It is what is on the land itself, because this is more in the control of the landowner, right? This looks like things like renovating the house on the land that you bought, or just like building a mansion on the same property that a poor person would have built a shack on. This matters because properties are probably just bought more for the house than the land that it's on, right? If land or like property in general is valued based on the demand of like how much consumers are going to want to buy it for, right? People will just care more about the house that's on the land because that's where people will be living in. That's what's most proximate to them. They care about like living in a really nice house rather than like living on like a really large piece of land, right? But we tell you that the tax that AF proposes is just like going to lead to this equal valuation of land, which means that these poor and rich people are probably just paying the same proportion of tax, right? We tell you that poor people are probably just like living in less desirable homes, but this isn't reflected in their tax, right? Weigh this then against the certainty of our counter model of an income tax, which is more likely to be progressive because it is directly based on your income. You can't control that. And even then, if you buy that tax evasion is going to be symmetrical, we at least don't harm the poor people by giving them no way out, by forcing them to pay the same tax as rich people. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
If rich and poor people really do live in the same area to the scale that you say, how do you explain the massive disparity in like incomes and GDP in different regions or countries?
Okay, if what you mean by that is that like different areas have different like productivity and like produce different amounts of goods, I think that's just not related to the place where people live in. That's just probably like more down to the industries that are reflected in these areas, not like the individual houses in which people are living in. All right, moving on into government revenue, I think that this is the key push from side Affirmative. The first thing they tell us is that you just get more tax because it's really unavoidable to pay a land valuation tax. The first thing to say is that most of this tax probably comes from like rich land, or would be coming from like rich landowners who are likely to be able to evade this tax for the reasons that we gave you at Riley. The first thing is just like you might just be able to afford a better lawyer, but secondly you have like connections to the valuation consultants to get undervaluation of your property and to pay less tax. But the second thing to say here is that if having more tax is really such a need, our counter proposition of increasing a tax that is just objectively progressive, like income tax, that is objectively based on how much you're earning, does so in a better way because you actually get this money to redistribute without harming the poor people on the way. I think what's unclear then, from side Affirmative, is why specifically a land valuation tax is the best way to increase government revenue when we have tried and tested ways that we know can be progressive, such as corporate and income taxes. I think any risk of having a regressive effect from this land valuation tax is not a risk that we're willing to take when there are alternatives to increase government revenue if you buy that is something that is incredibly important. The next thing they tell us is that there's just like always going to be land in a country and that's just always going to be owned by people. Look, we'd push back by saying that people are now just adverse to buying a property because of this additional tax. This is particularly likely because the people in the middle class, who are probably going to be the ones on the margin between like choosing to rent or purchasing a land, who probably have lots of like factors influencing the decision, now have this additional tax. Even if it is a low percentage, right, that is still just an extra factor that is more likely to drive you to renting instead of buying a property. You discourage land ownership. What this means then is probably just have less people choosing to go out and purchase land. This is a really large scale impact because the middle class is a majority of the population, because these people are the most likely to be affected here. Why should you care about this? It's because when people are forced into renting cycles, it's just a lot more difficult for them to have control over their future. When you're like when a really large proportion of your income, which is going towards things like your rent or mortgage, is now at the whim of a rich landowner who cares about making profit for himself, that is not something we're willing to stand for. We'd rather people own land for themselves. Next then, on the material we gave you about renting. I think the key pushback here is that there are
Yeah,
rent
why?
caps that can be put in place by the government. Two responses here. Firstly, rent caps just aren't particularly effective because they cause a shortage in the market. You now have more people wanting to rent property than you have properties that suppliers are willing to rent. What this leads then is you get black markets where like the rich landowners are probably just going to like rent out to their rich friends, and then this is the point at which you have more locking out of these poor people because they don't have the connections to the landowners in order to like beat these queues and things like that. Secondly though, governments just don't have much incentive to cap rents because it annoys the most powerful and richest voters. When you're being lobbied by people like landowners who have all the money and the power in the economy, you don't want to do something that is going to annoy these people a lot. Moving on then to ASP material on land availability.
POI.
They tell us that wealthy people own most of the land. We tell you that's not true because most people just aren't wealthy. Even though these people might have nicer houses on the land, it's just wealthy people are only let's say 5% of the population. They're not going to own 55% of the population because the average rich person doesn't have 11 houses. They don't have much interest to do so because that's just extra cost. They're probably gonna put money towards things like yachts and other luxuries. Because the marginal benefit of having an 11th house is just not that great. This doesn't mean that, and so what this means then is that tax just isn't being collected from wealthy people. It's probably just more likely to be distributed evenly across the entire economy, which is obviously not fair for the reasons we gave about people having wealth disparities. The next thing they tell us is that we now discourage massive land buyups. I think the first thing to say is that massive land buyups just aren't the most common thing in the world for the reasons I gave. Rich people don't want to buy heaps and heaps of land because the marginal benefit of having more land is not that big. But what I think is more important here is the question of what a small tax is more likely to affect. It's going to affect the rich person who the 1% tax is a tiny percent of the proportion of their income, or the poor person who this 1% tax is probably going to be a much larger portion of their income. These are the people who are now going to be discouraged from buying land. These are the people who are locked out from land ownership. Moving on then to a split point on public backlash. The first thing to say here is that this tax will just affect a large number of people. Everyone stands to be affected by altering land costs because everyone just lives somewhere. But the second thing to say is that when you make the cost of owning land higher, people will be greatly outraged in two ways. Firstly, it's particularly harmful because the powerful and rich landowners who control the economy and that they lobby politicians and things like that are going to be mad that they have to pay more money. These are the people who have the capacity to outrage, even if it is only a small amount of harm to them. But secondly, these poor people will have no choice but to be outraged because their cost of living is just hugely increased. Note that large proportions of these people's income is made up from rent or their mortgage because they're not buying much of luxuries and stuff like that. These people now can't put food on their table for their children. They have no choice but to outrage.
Thank you for your speech, and I'd like to welcome up the first speaker for the affirmative.
If we can prove that the government will make more money off of these land taxes, which they can then spend on social development, then we can claim the benefits of decreasing poverty, decreasing crime, and increasing the general quality of life, and this means that we win this debate. 2 points of clash in this debate. First of all, how are vulnerable people impacted? And second of all is how will people react to this tax? On to my first point of clash around how vulnerable people are impacted. First of all, I would like to disagree with the first speaker's characterization that renters are poor for 3 main reasons. First of all, people will rent maybe because they're unsure about where they want to live, and so they do not want to commit to buying a house in that area and want to check it out before actually putting in that money. Second of all, people do travel. If you are traveling around countries in the world, you're not going to buy a house in every single country you want to go to. You are likely to stay in motels or hotels, or if you want to stay for a longer period of time, you will rent. Third of all, we think that people are actually forced to rent because international investors will buy this land and all the other houses may be too expensive for you to buy. So in some cases, people will actually be forced to rent when they do not want to. This means that a lot of the foundational analysis of poor renters being affected does not always stand under Neg's side. About land value, we hear that we hear that there is varying income in the same locations. I think my previous speakers have given you reasons why, but I would like to introduce 2 more. Is that first of all, neighbourhoods are actually built at the same time. Often, when you see new developments such as the ones in Auckland, these houses will cost roughly the same. This means that people who are buying these houses will have roughly the same income in order to be able to afford at least a deposit on this house. Second of all, is that rich people can afford choice. If you are a rich person, you are able to afford almost every single house in the country. You will probably pick the nicest ones, the ones where you get the most benefit. If you're a poor person, you cannot do this, which means that your choice is severely limited, which means that within the country, there are specific areas where you can afford to live. A rich person can afford to live everywhere. This means that, rich people are pretty snobby, right? I think that it's fair to say they take a lot of pride in being able to say, yeah, you know what, I live in, Monu, I don't live in Tikipunga, which means that rich people are actually less likely to live by poor people, if only to be able to say, yeah, I'm rich, I'm so cool, I can live in this really, poshy area. We hear a lot about how landlords will raise the rent, and this will directly impact vulnerable and poor renters because they need to be able to make up for this money that they are losing due to this income tax. 4 responses to this. First of all, which one of my previous speakers have touched on, is about there is a price ceiling. We asked this in the POA, and my second speaker touched on this. But second of all, if rent does raise a bit, I think that we can still claim the benefits of there being other areas into which money is funneled from the government's income from this tax in which this is equalised. This means that maybe you have to spend a little bit more on rent, but because the government has decreased the amount of money it takes for a social service, you're maybe no longer spending less money on public transport. So it is easier for you, it costs less for you to go to uni, to go to school, to ride the bus to work, and this will equalise out of your rent versus what you are getting out of social services and services provided by the government. Third of all, due to scarcity, which my previous speakers have explained, the price will drop. This means that landlords cannot keep on raising the price because if nobody can afford it, nobody will be renting from them. They cannot make money. This is pretty basic. This is pretty simple. Fourth of all, there are subsidies. And as we have proven, the government will certainly, this can be weighed on certainty that we will be making money from this tax, then the government can use this money to subsidise taxes for people who need it, which means that this will not impact poor people unsymmetrically. Yeah, I'll take a point of cash.
If people can't afford rent, aren't they more likely to make sacrifices in other areas of their life because they just have to have somewhere to live?
I think we've given you a lot of reasons why people will actually just, if you were listening to my point, I just gave you 4 reasons why the rent won't become so expensive that people can't actually afford it. I think that in every single way, poor people do have to make sacrifices. That is why you are poor. It is because you do not have the ability to splurge on these luxuries that rich people have. This is not actually something that you can claim on either side of the house because poor people will always be more unfairly impacted, unfortunately. Alright, on to my second point of clash around how will people react to this tax. We hear from previous speakers that there is no benefit of having an 11th house. I think that, part of this is kind of just, being able to brag, but also is that a lot of the time these rich people need land for businesses. If you're someone who owns a business and you're rich of that business, you need to own land in order to station this on. This means that a lot of the time, these businesses are actually very bad for the environment. They are actually having runoff issues that impact the people around them. Having a land tax means that it is easier to hold these businesses accountable for the issues that they are creating in a society, and it means that, that's pretty much it. We hear that rich people have ways around the systems, and these are not available to the poor, which is another reason why they will be unfairly impacted. 2 reasons, or 2 rebuttals to this. First of all, again, is that rich people will always have an advantage. They are rich. They are simply able to do this. We don't actually see why this doesn't happen under the net counter model. The net has said that they will simply increase income taxes. However, they've also acknowledged that people do have loopholes around these taxes. So why, if we are increasing income taxes and rich people are currently able to avoid income taxes due to the loopholes, why will we not just continue seeing this? At least on our side of the house, we are saying, as my previous speakers have said, it is so hard to get out of a land tax because you cannot just say, you can't just lie about the value of the land because the government can see that. You can't just lie about your name on the land because, again, there are checks and balances in place. But an income tax in which it is already proven that people do have the methods to get out of, why is this not easier for people to cheat and for people to not pay their fair taxes, especially when they are rich and are contributing and are getting the benefits of being in society while not properly contributing it? This is simply not fair. This is harming vulnerable people more on your side of the house. Okay. Again, we think that Negating has not properly acknowledged all of the mechanisms that we have given you at first about why people will want to buy property, about why people will not be able to buy property because if there is no land tax, and why having a land tax is actually better, and is actually more beneficial. I would ask for you to please acknowledge some of these points. All right. At the end of this debate, we have proven that the governmental income does increase. This means that we have more of an income to support the citizens of a country. We have more income to support the marginalised and vulnerable groups within our society. For example, building hospitals in impoverished areas, or putting more money into charities like Habitat for Humanity. This means that we can ensure more wealth equality. We think that this means there is less incentive for people to buy lots and lots of higher quality properties for both local and foreign investors. This means that there is more land for the locals and the people who are directly contributing to our economy. This means that people cannot cheat taxes by living on developing properties, by just skating out of their income taxes, because they are actually held accountable. This is certain. And so if you believe that at the very, very least, at the end of this debate, the only thing that we can properly prove on our side of the house is that with land taxes, the government makes some more money, and we have proven it is actually a lot of the money, but even if you don't believe that we have made some more money, then the gigantic scale of the money that we get and the amount of good that this can do, the amount of good that this can do for such vulnerable people, then we believe that this is enough for us to win this debate alone.
Speech, and would now like to welcome up the negating third speaker for the negating team.
Aff wants to win by making poor people's lives better by taking their money and then giving it back to them via the government. We think that there is a more efficient way of doing this by using a more progressive tax system that takes the money from the people who don't really need it, right? I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. Firstly, on availability, whether they really get more houses on the market and whether this actually helps people. Secondly, I'll talk about renters. And then thirdly, I'll talk about this sort of proportionality, where the money comes from, why it's more likely to hit the poor harder. Okay, on availability, their point here is that, they're saying that people are going to sell their houses because they're more expensive to own, but they give no reason like landlords, I guess, are going to put their houses up on the market because it's too expensive to keep renting them. First of all, we just don't think this is going to happen on a large scale unless you make your tax a bit bigger than 1 to 2% per year. But we also tell you that they've given absolutely no reason for why people are now able to buy these houses, because they are also more expensive as well. Any reduction in the price due to an increase in supply is also going to be it's also going to be matched by people just being less able to afford them because of the tax. Yeah.
If you're proposing an income tax as an alternative, why would landlords not just hike rents anyways to make up for the income disparity? Is this not like a symmetrical harm?
Wait. Why do they not hike rents to make up for the income disparity? Okay. No, this is not true because not all. Okay, it's still better because not all like wealthy people are landowners, right? So we still get like less hiking of rents because on your tax, almost all of the tax is directed at landlords, whereas on our side, like not every wealthy person is a landlord. So it's just different. Okay. Good POI there. We also tell you that like corporate tax, for example, has no effect on renters' direction. Anyway, so they said that availability increases because people sell houses. We just don't think that that's, or people put more houses on the market. It's just not realistic. We've also heard that like, because the new owners will have to pay this cost. So we've had basically no reason for why this there's going to be a redistribution from the rich people owning these houses to the poorer people. Okay. Then they said that like overseas investors are going to like stop like investing in building houses because of the tax, right? Because it's less profitable for them to own these houses. We think this actually harms the amount of houses available for people to live in if overseas people stop building them. And we also just don't think that overseas people will like have such a massive stake in the market as they've tried to suggest, because we think that like plenty of land in New Zealand or whatever country is just owned by the people who live there, because you know that's the people who live there and own it. They're not going to sell the entire like country because they need to use it. All right. Anyway, next on to our renters. All right. We've told you pretty clearly that when landlords have increased costs, directly increased costs because they are a landlord, because there is a land tax, they're going to increase their prices. The only reason that they've given us for why they won't do this is, first of all, they suggested that it's like illegal or like immoral. We just, first of all, don't think it's illegal. Second of all, we just think that landlords are profit motivated and like having a rent for a property just isn't immoral. And then they've also suggested that there are rent caps, but this just makes no sense because like you can't just cap every single rent of every property like right before you introduce your motion. Like obviously rent prices have to fluctuate to allow for the market. And it's not like these rents are going to be like crazily increasing to the point where the government has to step in. They're just going to be more expensive. But why is this important? It's because we tell you that renters are the most vulnerable people in society. We know that owning a home is good. So the only people who don't own homes fundamentally are the people who can't, because the down payment is too expensive, because you know they can't afford to pay off the mortgage. So they've said that like there are examples of people that aren't like poorer that are renters, but like that they're traveling or that they just don't want to commit to buying a house. This washes out. They're just clearly not the majority of renters. And we so we still think that it is these lower incomes that make up the majority of renters and are the most harmed by these increased prices. So when these lower income renters have to pay more on their rent, we've heard that like poor people just have to make sacrifices, and they're already making sacrifices. This is not a response. Like obviously, when these poor people are already living paycheck to paycheck, every dollar counts. Like they have barely any savings. They have barely any like spare money that they can be putting away. They aren't spending their money on Netflix subscriptions that they can cut, right? Literally every dollar that they earn is going into their rent, their electricity, and their food. So when their rent gets more expensive, these things are these things are going to pay the price. This is absolutely nothing that we cannot stand for some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So then, moving on from renters who are going to have higher prices and are clearly the most vulnerable, just want to talk more broadly about like where this money is coming from, whether it's poorer people or richer people, right? And why this matters. So into this, okay. So no, like I think it's pretty intuitive that what the value of your land you'll live on is not always going to be directly related to your income. We've given you examples for like why sometimes people of different incomes can live on the same land, which is just that people have different incomes, but not all land is like inherently that different. Like if you have a city that is subdivided into like thousands of lots, right, that are all going to be just basically the exact same value, right, because there's no inherent difference between them, like in lots of regions, there are still going to be variations in income in those areas. There are still always going to be some people who have more and some people who have less. So when we see that the people who have less have to pay the same tax as those who have more, we have a regressive tax system, right? So these people who are paying more tax, we think that this is inherently bad because for the same reasons as the renters, just on a smaller scale, they just have less money that they can afford to be spending on it, and it makes up a higher proportion of their income. We also tell you that like rich people with more income just aren't going to live on high value land all the time because people care less about what land they live on than just the house that they live in, right? So they're just more likely to invest their money into their actual house because that's just going to have more impact on their day-to-day life. And this again just isn't accounted for in their tax. The other reason they've given us for why rich people will pay like more of this tax is that they own businesses, and these businesses, like, because they have the land, this land isn't going to pay the tax, right? We think that like businesses just don't make up the majority of land area in the country. It's still going to primarily come from like residential things. But we also tell you that if you increase the cost of businesses, that's just going to increase prices again, which is not something that they should stand for. And then finally, on why like more of this money is going to be coming from people with less incomes, it's just that rich people just have more freedom to manipulate the system and be able to avoid this tax and avoid taking the full brunt of it in a way that would be proportional to their income, right? Like they said that it's, I don't know what they said, just that like you can't avoid tax or that it's illegal. We just say this is empirically not true, right? Like there are mechanisms people can use to do with the law, to do with hiring lawyers, to, if not completely avoid it, just make sure that they're paying less than maybe someone who doesn't have the time and money to like go through all this effort would. We tell you that basically unresponded to, like, if you just like prioritize moving into an area that has a lower land value and then just building a nice house on top of it, you will pay less tax when poor people don't have this freedom to move around and live where they want to because they just have less time, money and resources to do so. So at the end of this, we tell you that if you want to help the people that are with this government money, you should just not be taking it from them, and then from them, and a progressive tax would be a better way of accomplishing all of their benefits. Thank you.
Speak for speech. As customary, I would now like to reverse the speaking order and advise the speaker from the Negating team if we get
The risk of implementing a tax that is regressive is not worth a speculative benefit to government revenue. A couple of things to look at in the speech. Firstly, on whether or not the tax will be regressive to any effect and the harms to lower socioeconomic groups, and secondly then on government revenue. Okay, why is whether or not the tax is going to be regressive and the harms to lower socioeconomic groups the most important point? Two reasons. Firstly, on vulnerability. When we risk widening the wealth gap through a potentially regressive tax for the sake of hoping for the government to A, get more government tax revenue, but for B, for this to actually end up in tangible benefits in the lives of poor people, I think that is just a risk to the people who we should care the most about in this debate. But secondly, on scale, since everyone stands to be affected by this tax because everyone lives somewhere, whether you're renting or owning this land, I think that this tax just has the capacity to impact every single person in the country. Okay, the first thing to look at then on this point is what actually determines the valuation of land. I think the most important mechanism that has been explained here is on location. We explained down the line why land valuation isn't directly proportional to income, because rich and poor people might both choose to live in a certain area for so many other factors than just how much income they have and how much they want to brag. This looks like things like proximity to work and to relatives. These are important things to people's lives. We didn't face contention from that from AF. What this means then is you get a range of people living in certain areas. You get neighborhoods with a range of socioeconomic groups. I think AF's key pushback here is that like neighborhoods tend to be really uniform and they're like built at the same time, so all the houses are the same. We told you a couple of things. Firstly, this is probably just only a small proportion of new developments. But secondly, like once these people are in these houses, even if they are the same like houses in the first place, they can like renovate or improve the house, which is just never reflected in the tax because it's only based on the land, which is obviously not going to change because the location of the land doesn't change. What this means then is that even if you get some degree of similarity in the incomes of these people, it's not going to be precisely the same, like down to the dollar or anything, which means that the tax inherently risks a regressive effect. Even if you only have a couple of like poor people who live in the same neighborhood as rich people, that is just not a risk that we're willing to take because it is a risk that harms these people so disproportionately. Moving on then to renters. We explained why most renters are likely to be relatively poor, because like most people who can afford to have land will, because like it's more stable to have a mortgage from a bank than to pay rent to a landowner. I think the key pushback we get here is that just like people might be traveling or something like that and so are renting. I think like the scale of this is never made clear. I think it's pretty clear that most people who are renting are there to live because people need to have somewhere to live. I think travel is probably just a pretty small portion of the income, particularly based on the fact that there's like moving around the place. They're never going to be in one like specific place for a long time. Okay, why then was our counter model of just implementing an inherently progressive tax different to implementing the land tax? I think the difference that Connor pointed out was that all landlords are now going to be facing increased costs, whereas like an income tax you don't have the same effect directly to landlords. What that means then is that all renters are going to face increased rents. I think that like the mechanism of having rent caps wasn't reasonable for the reasons that we gave down the line on like market distortion and how you actually get worse distribution because you get things like black markets, rich landowners just selling to their rich friends. The next thing then was on land availability. I think this point is pretty counterintuitive because we hear that now rich people won't be buying as much land, which allows poor people to be buying land. I think a 1% tax is just more likely to be a big effect in a poor person's life because it is a bigger proportion of their income. It is going to impact their lives more. I think what this means then is you actually get less poor people being able to like choose land availability over, being able to choose land ownership over renting. Note the marginal analysis that we gave you on why it's likely to be such a large-scale impact, because it is the people in the middle class who are likely to be on this margin who are going to be impacted the most. Proud to oppose.
Thanks for your speech. And finally, I'd like to welcome up the reply speaker of the Affirmative team.
I would love to live in a world where wealthy people are completely incapable of avoiding tax and where the poorest people are going to benefit the most from it. Unfortunately, side negating's idealistic world is just not going to work. Okay, 2 points of clash in today's debate. Firstly, on who benefits lower income individuals more, and secondly, on how are the wealthy going to be impacted. Okay, what did we give you on the benefits to lower income individuals? We gave you several mechanisms for this, all the way at first. Firstly, on the government income, secondly, on the economic growth, and thirdly, on cheaper properties. What was the responses that we got to an increase in government income? They said, it's okay, we're going to implement a wealth tax and this is going to make it symmetrical. I don't think this is true, and we have given several mechanisms and several rebuttals as to why this is not going to work, because it's a lot harder to evade a property tax than it is to evade income tax, right? And even if that does stand, and even if they do apply an income tax, this is still going to harm your poorer people. So they're trying to claim that they are going to help these people more, but you still literally harm these individuals regardless. Okay, what else did we say about this? We said that, I still think like all the stuff that we gave you on the fact that like government is better able to take care of these people still stands. There was no real responses as to like the subsidization that we actually gave you and the material that the government has more capacity to help people rent or help people even get into a position to purchase a house because it is more affordable for them to rent. Okay, what did we get under economic prosperity? We said that this is going to be more economically stable or more stable of an income for the government, therefore making the economy more stable because we have consistency, because we literally just have a finite amount of properties within a country. Things like inflation or job losses do not affect the amount of money that is going to be earned. And this was brought up, I think, at first, maybe later. What did we also hear under cheaper properties? They just said, no, this isn't going to happen. I think it came out at leaders, maybe, that people are going to, like, not, only the wealthy people are now going to buy. Again, I think all our material stands on the fact that the government is literally just making the money. They can make it more possible for people to buy. But again, because there's just overall going to be less people purchasing, I think properties are still going to be cheaper, and I think that still stands, right? We also heard a lot in like wealth disparity. For example, you're going to be wealthy and living next to someone who isn't poor, or who is poor. Okay, a few things. Even if you do buy this, like, and it is going to be a very poor person living in a very high value neighborhood, I think we gave you a lot of material on why this isn't true. But even if it is true, it's probably going to be a very small proportion of people. So you can't really weigh this on scale whatsoever. But also, if this does happen, it's probably more likely, and Lara pointed this out in her third speech, it's probably more likely to be a wealthy person living in a poorer area or a lower value area because they have choice, whereas poorer people do not have this like luxury of choosing where they live. Okay, what did we actually hear under landlords or like the wealthy and how they are impacted? Okay. They said these people can be really angry and they're going to start raising prices, but then simultaneously told us they aren't going to be affected because this is only a 1 to 2% tax increase. So therefore, I don't think any of the material stands on the fact that rent prices are going to be jacked up because they literally said that these people aren't going to feel any form of effect from this taxing. So I'm not really sure what that's supposed to actually lead to. But like even if you do believe that these prices are going to be jacked up, we've given you a lot of reasons as to why it isn't. We've like said that things like market caps exist. That people are only willing to pay a certain amount for rent, and it can only be increased by such a proportion until it just becomes ridiculous. For both of these reasons, I think we won today's debate.
Well, thank you all for a very engaging debate. I invite you now to cross the floor and shake hands.
Oh, before everyone heads out, can I just get everyone to confirm their name and speaking position because it's a wee bit different to the online tab. So,
I'm Ella, I'm first.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Yanae, I'm second.
I'm Lara, I'm third.
Great.
Riley first.
Mm-hmm.
Nikash, second in reply.
Yep.
Corona third.
Brilliant. Thank you guys.
Wait, what photo? What? Sorry. Good job. Good job. Good job. Okay, wait, I think that was a friend handshake. None of us
I saw that.
No, we did that for a previous debate because we weren't here.
Or the Northland.